and creating more problems that can't be covered with a blanket solution. And this is why climate change is known as a risk multiplier. As Margaret Atwood succinctly put it, it's not climate change, it's everything change. Because these shifts and effects are unevenly distributed on local, national, and global levels, it is not enough to focus on the environmental and physical science of climate change for solutions. We also need to examine the interconnectedness of economic, political, and ethical issues surrounding the causes and impacts of climate change and act accordingly. This is what climate justice does. It is both a framework to address inequities and reduce further climate change, and a movement that seeks to redress the systems of power that continue to marginalize, oppress, and harm people and planet. The climate justice movement is multidimensional. It's made up of several different movements, sectors, and walks of life, all united under the umbrella of the great multiplier that is climate change, all recognizing that impacts on nature are not separate to human impacts and vice versa. There's the labor movement, who want to ensure workers are paid fairly and given benefits, who demand that people on the front lines and people working in the oil and gas industry are not left behind as we begin to move away from fossil fuels. To ensure farm workers aren't exploited by big corporations and overworked and left without livelihoods with increasing heat, droughts, and floods. There's the global Indigenous movement, which stands against issues that directly affect their lands, peoples, and respective cultures, standing against violence towards their people and environment by those with power. Climate justice is racial justice. Last summer's rallying cry following the murder of George Floyd in the US was, "I can't breathe." It spoke to police brutality, but also of environmental injustice. In the US and at home in the UK, communities with higher populations of people of color are exposed to disproportionately high levels of air pollutants due to proximity of waste incinerators, high traffic areas, and redevelopment of contaminated lands known as brownfields. Not only that, but it was Black and brown people who were disproportionately impacted by and likely to die from COVID-19, even after adjusting for a laundry list of factors. And why? Race-based health inequalities that existed before COVID. Social inequalities affecting health outcomes include living in polluted areas, overcrowded housing, job insecurity, and low-paid work, and rampant institutional discrimination, all of which will and are worsening with climate change. Climate justice is land justice, interrogating who owns the land, who has access to it. 2/3 of land in England is owned by less than 1% of the population. Even access to green space is unequal, which we saw during the lockdown as well. It was mostly people of color who didn't have access to parks and the mental health benefits of outdoor green spaces. Climate change is a human rights issue, causing hunger, displacement, unemployment, illness, and death. Climate justice is intergenerational justice, the idea that generations have responsibility for future generations. What will the planet be like for future generations? What is it like for children now, already impacted by climate change? We see the youth fighting injustice, rallying to hold leaders in fossil fuel companies to account to reduce emissions, but what of their childhoods? Climate justice asks, where and who is impacted the most, how, why, and importantly, what is being done to account for it all in a way that doesn't cause more harm? Climate justice interrogates the root cause of the injustices and inequalities born from climate change, which lie heavily in the extractive nature of colonial capitalism. Case in point, 5 of the biggest banks in the UK funded over £40 billion into coal alone between 2018 and 2020. But it goes back even further. Modern European empires expanded, using violence and control to colonize and settle onto lands inhabited by native peoples, erasing their cultures and exploiting resources like fossil fuels, minerals, food, wildlife, water, and even people for profit. This abuse of resources continues today, particularly in former colonies in the global south, to feed our consumption in the global north. Like in Malaysia, where the UK, US, Germany, and Italy send their plastic waste. This abuse also comes in the form of harmful eco-fascist ideals, like Prince William's recent comments attributing African population increase to the decline of Africa's wildlife and wild spaces, saying this is challenging for conservationists. When the wealthiest 10% of the world produced half of all emissions between 1990 and 2015, and Western conservation strategies have destroyed the livelihoods of millions of indigenous peoples. Not only is there an economic North-South divide, there are divisions within countries in the global North that lead to similar exploitation and injustice. Take, for instance, the environmental injustices of what is known as Cancer Alley in the state of Louisiana in the US, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where mostly Black and brown communities are laden with toxic chemicals from petrochemical plants. This area was originally dubbed plantation country, where enslaved people were forced into labor. Or take the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, where oil fields the size of England have contaminated the traditional lands and health of Indigenous communities that still live there. What these scenarios have in common is development and extraction without consultation or concern for nature or local communities. They have in common racism, health inequality, a lack of or degradation of green spaces, little to no political power. And despite it all, a great deal of dedicated community activism to fight for their lives. At the global level, climate change solutions have typically been based on emissions, who emits the most, who has emitted the most historically, and how they can reduce their emissions to that of 1990s levels. You might have heard of this little thing called the UN Conference of Parties, or COP, but to reduce it down to a condensed definition, that's the annual meeting where nations get together under pithy slogans like Keep 2.5 alive. It's where they negotiate who is responsible for climate change and its devastating impacts and what each of their respective countries promises to do so it won't get worse. We're already at around 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and seeing the wildfires, drought, heat, and storms kick off, myriad species and entire ecosystems lost, people being displaced. The most vulnerable countries were told in 2009 that the wealthier high-emitting countries would provide $100 billion in finance to them per year by 2020, but didn't. And the finance they did provide was mostly loans, which are increasing the burden to the vulnerable nations. Climate change as we know it is a human-caused problem needing human-centered solutions. From the destructive economic and political systems and devastation of lands, water, and air, to the loss and abuse of all living things, climate justice demands not only equitable public policies and outcomes for the immediate future, but retribution for damage already done. It requires solutions to be built with and for the people and places most affected. It will require just transition, providing climate finance to the countries and communities who have suffered great losses and damages in the face of climate change with little recourse. It will require institutional divestment from fossil fuel companies by universities, pension funds, and charitable foundations. And it will require societal shifts to cultures where life and nature is valued and not exploited for personal gain. It will require all of us. Whether your focus is on creating art or curating collections, designing sustainable and accessible buildings or planning cities, organizing in your community, or teaching people how to grow their own food, everyone has a role in rectifying the wrongs of climate injustice to make the world a better place for those impacted now and in the years to come. To paraphrase the great Felid philosopher Mufasa's words to his young son, everything the light touches, it is yours to protect. So must we. For even the darkest reaches of the earth where the light does not permeate is ours to protect.
Thank you, Cherise. Let's stop sharing the screen. Thank you, Cherise. That was really informative. And, you know, Mufasa had a great point. We'll go through some more of those points in the discussion shortly. And remember, if you have any questions, you can send them through into the Q&A. So we're now going to show you a short film that we put together this year with a really amazing group of climate activists from around the world who are sharing their messages for COP26. So this was part of a series funded by the British Council, which was focused on the Global South. And you can see this one and another another short film that we've also made on our policy portal, and we'll be launching 2 more very soon. So let me get this one up for everyone.
We need more actions and we need more advances.
Sorry about that.
My one key message to take to COP26, there's still a hope. If we are fixing it simultaneously, there are still hope.
We need to walk the talk. We have seen commitment of 100 billion annually.
It's not enough. We need more actions and we need more advances.
For them to also show political will in dealing with the climate change crisis that is the defining issue of our time.
A commitment to action right now. Yesterday, as we say in South America. We need it yesterday.
People are dying. People are losing their lives every day, every minute, every second. So the time to act is now.
Humans were smart enough to start the Industrial Revolution and speed up climate change. So it means we are smart enough to start a climate revolution.
Take the issue seriously in a holistic perspective. Don't divert the blame from corporations or political institutions.
We should all come together, those with resources, put as much as possible, those who can do more, do more.
Take the responsibility together and act together.
With the collaboration of the talent in their countries.
We need to put investments in real projects on the ground, renewable energy, forest restoration, and more of these things at scale.
I think one of the most important issues about climate crisis is the biodiversity loss.
It's important to put climate as a face, the face of people, the face of ecosystems, and not only think of climate as an economy or policy issue.
It's not enough for ministers and politicians and campaigners to do the work, but we must show the people who are directly affected by climate change what is at stake for them.
The message is clear: invest in the arts and cultures as part of the integrated climate action interventions.
That way we can have a more sustainable campaign, a campaign that is owned by people and protected by the people.
Making the most of the indigenous knowledge to make it a locally rooted conversation in our indigenous spaces.
And we will ensure that the future of the humanity and the planet is saved, and we will ensure that we have each other's back.
The world is one. Culture, science, and creativity should be blended, should be brought together to save life.
How could we do this, face the hardest of tasks that we might have had to face as a humanity, which is the oncoming climate crisis?
Con un respeto en absoluto a la grandeza de la tierra, del universo, y de eso divino, espiritual e intangible.
Do it while we still laugh and enjoy being in this world. I think that this will open unexpected paths.
Love this earth.
Great. So we are now going to welcome back Charisse, and we're also joined by Vicky Sword-Daniels and Alexandra Alberta. Vicky is an expert in climate and disaster resilience. Vicky is a social volcanologist and holds a doctorate in urban sustainability and resilience. She has a background in interdisciplinary research, knowledge exchange, and evaluation, focusing on the social impacts of environmental change and building resilience. In her career, she has worked across sectors, including engineering, academia, and international development. Vicky has also joined JB this year as the Arts Council England Programme Lead, supporting the arts and culture sector to understand and improve environmental performance and to share learning about experiences and solutions. And Alexandra Alberta is the first ever curator of Indigenous Perspectives at Manchester Museum with the University of Manchester. She joined Manchester Museum from Bournemouth University, where she was a doctoral researcher in graphic medicine and curatorial practice and research illustrator, including the Data Storytelling Workbook. Her research and practice critically engages with institutional structures of power that limit civic engagement and do not facilitate needed reparative reconciliation, amplification of marginalized voices, and displacement of colonial power. So thank you both for joining us. Alexandra, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do in Manchester.
All right, so my name is Alexandra. You can just call me Alex. I am a olive-skinned woman in her early 30s. I have long brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm joining you from a school in Manchester where I've been running workshops on Indigenous gardening, which is, you might hear some noise in the background as school is getting let out right now. But so at Manchester Museum, when I got the role a year ago, one of the things I did was I started consultations. And that was really important because my role is looking at curatorial practice and behavioral change around moving from decolonization and still doing that work, but moving into indigenization. So shifting the power of who is at the center of the action we do in the museum. And when I was having these consultations, I wanted to bring in Indigenous people and different organizations to ask, what in that action should we be focusing on? And so in that, very much it was languages and climate. So immediately I went back to the director and said, okay, in the work we do, this needs to be a focus, which works really well because at the Manchester Museum right now, we're in a capital development project. And one of the things we are working on is creating an environmental action group. That might not be the name it is in the end, or we're still working through what is that name. And it was lovely hearing from everyone else different names to call this type of work that we do, and to think about how that then calls us to action. So over that, we have brought in Indigenous speakers to help us share the learning and pass that on, and so that the learning isn't those that aren't, so coming 3 degrees away or not actually contributing to building relationships. So putting that at the center. So we've had one speaker, Rosalind Lapierre, came in and really talked about the slow violence of natural history, and especially natural history that is in museums. So what are the different types of collections and how we teach with our collections? And in our program today, and this program we're a part of, was thought of as a pilot to see with learning and engagement how we might indigenize those types of experiences. And we even found within the last 2 days, there's so many times we ask young people to look at our natural history collections and what do they think of it, but then we come up with an answer which is usually based on Western science. And so how could we actually turn this knowledge around to bring in different knowledge systems and to not get kids asking, oh, but is this true? Is this false? So that's just one aspect. We're kind of working with how can we reconceptualize our collections to call to action. So if we change how people think about environment or the fiction of nature as this location outside of our daily lives that we must go to, but actually seeing ourselves back into it to try to reinstate an idea of kinship, an idea of community and relationship. And the other things we've supported and helped other organizations is around art and creation and conversation. So Totem Latamat, which was commissioned by Border Crossings and went to COP26. Some of you might have seen it there or heard about it. But what was so important about that piece is that actually at the end of its journeys, it got returned to the earth. So thinking about artistic practice and thinking about the types of things that we support in museums that doesn't go behind glass, doesn't get sectioned off and then takes up even more space in a building that needs to be heated and insulated. But then we talk about climate with it. But actually, this piece was touched. It was outside while it was here. And then now we returned it. I helped pull the ropes to break it down into the earth, and it's been covered in snows, and wasps are making a home out of it. So in thinking about when we're doing this action is also the processes and practices we do. So that's just a little bit of taste, but you'll find I have my hands in just about everything at the museum.
Amazing, thank you. It's really great to hear about all of the work that you're doing. So yeah, thank you so much, Alex. I'd like to invite everyone to all of the speakers to unmute, and we'll get into a discussion now. So firstly, we have heard a little bit about COP26, which has just finished in Glasgow. Vicky, can you explain some of the frameworks or some of the language that we might have seen used throughout these negotiations?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of jargon around COP, and there are three, I think, key interrelated concepts. So mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And you will have heard a lot more probably about adaptation and loss and damage in this year's COP26. So they are interrelated. Mitigation is essentially about preventing climate change impacts. So it's about the actions that we take to prevent and reduce climate change by reducing carbon emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere via carbon sinks that absorb carbon, so sort of our soil, oceans and forests, for example. Adaptation is about managing the impacts of climate change. So where mitigation is unable to stop all impacts of climate change, we're already feeling those impacts today. Adaptation is about managing that. So it's the actions that we take to build resilience, to reduce vulnerability and build our capacities to anticipate, cope and recover from shocks and stresses. As I said, the impacts of climate change are already being felt, so particularly in developing countries who've contributed the least to global emissions. And vulnerable populations face the greatest impacts of climate change and also have the fewest means to cope. Across the world, we need to adapt now to those current changes, and we need to adapt to future changes that are already baked into the system through the 1 degree warming that we have already reached. But we also need to support the adaptation of the most vulnerable people and places who have been put in that position through unequal causation. And now loss and damage, finally, might be a new one to some of you. It's really risen up the agenda. So it's about responding to climate change impacts. Losses are generally seen as kind of permanent losses that can't be recovered. For example, loss of biodiversity, species loss of cultural heritage. Whereas damage refers to impacts that may be able to be repaired or restored. But ultimately, loss and damage has come about as a result of shortcomings in both mitigation policy, failing to meet our targets, and inadequate action and support for adaptation in communities that are already experiencing the biggest impacts from climate change. So the need to deal with loss and damage is rising up the political agenda. And it's a call to support those most impacted by climate change through cooperation, technical support, and finance. And key to this issue and why it is so contentious politically is because it's about who takes responsibility for those losses. And developing countries are calling for reparations from richer countries to the poorer ones for historical emissions. And it makes it a contentious issue for big emitters. In general, in COP26, you might have heard more about these terms, adaptation, loss and damage. They are increasingly urgent and important and bring increased focus to climate justice as well.
Thank you, Vicky. What do you think was successful or unsuccessful from a climate justice perspective at this year's COP? Charisse, maybe we can go to you.
Sure. I mean, really quickly, I would just say Unsuccessful, so we'll start with the negative. Unsuccessful was definitely accessibility. Policies aside, something that was pretty glaring was that, for all this talk about justice and needing to thinking about the most vulnerable and all of that, they weren't even able to come, like people representing different nations and different vulnerable communities on that weren't even able to, and even if they were there, they couldn't get into the spaces that they needed to be in. So I would say that is an area that they've really got to work on in the future, is making COP actually accessible and not having it be a completely closed off event for high-level policymakers to come and just be. I mean, I hate to put it like, it's not like a party that they're having every year, but it does sometimes it does kind of seem that way, right? When you're like, okay, you guys are just coming together every year to have your little closed-door parties while everyone else suffers. So for me, that was what was unsuccessful, but successfully, as we always see, is the groundswell of activism, right? So outside of COP, physically outside of COP, and then also just around the world, all of the solidarity that we saw and all the rallies that were happening and everything. So that was a success.
Thank you. Vicky, do you have anything to add to that?
I think obviously my focus is adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage. Is kind of where my background is. And I think there was a lot more focus on adaptation, which is good. And there was an increased funding commitment. So there was $356 million of new funding donated or given to the Adaptation Fund. But it falls way short on hitting the target of £100 billion a year that was promised to developing countries from the developed nations in the Paris Agreement. I think we've reached $80 billion a year, and that is just not enough. And $100 billion a year in itself is not enough for adaptation. So, what didn't deliver was the finance needed for adaptation. And I think that loss and damage, I mean, it's coming up the agenda very, very slowly, but it is coming up the agenda, which is a good thing. I mean, Scotland was the only country to make a contribution to a fund on loss and damage, and they contributed £2 million, I think hoping that other wealthy nations would sort of jump in, but it's been heavily resisted, in particular by the EU and the United States, who remain really wary about a legal precedent-setting move to contributing finance to loss and damage. So instead, a technical assistance program was set up to support countries to avoid future disasters and was included in the agreement. It became its own article. Loss and damage is separate to adaptation and to mitigation. But it's just not enough. And there is an urgent need for a financing mechanism to support those countries already impacted by climate change.
Amazing. Thank you, Vicky. Alex, during the COP proceedings, a British oil executive referred to herself as Indigenous to the UK and claimed that fossil fuel exploration was her Indigenous right to protect the energy interests of her country. Many people in the UK might not have a broader understanding of what indigeneity means and might not understand why there's been such a backlash among climate activists to that claim. Can you please explain why it's important for us to understand a more global framework of Indigenous rights?
Yes, so Indigenous is really framed by who were the first peoples in this land who have, in more complicated definitions of have religion and ceremony and complete cultures built from these landscapes. So when we think of Indigenous with the capital I, we're thinking of peoples that have that long relationship. However, so in the UK context, and especially British, is that many of the peoples claiming this, and it has been, Indigenous has been taken by the far right in this country to be used to make these claims, and also that racial divide of deciding who white, is this indigenous, when in fact many of white British people are colonizers in their history because they come from Europe. And so there's a lot of this when you're looking at the identity and what it would even mean to be indigenous to a land, is you have to trace these roots. And it's deeper than skin color, but it often gets adopted as to make these claims, to do bad behavior because there is certain concessions to traditional activity. And so if you look at, for instance, the UN's, we're about to start the decade of Indigenous languages. English will not be listed as an Indigenous language here in the UK. Manx is, Welsh is, Gaelic Scottish is. And so you can even look at just the different languages that are associated with that, and they're not the typical kind of like English. So by adopting that though, and then doing these bad behaviors or investing in things that are negative, it also then creates in the public mind this idea of Indigenous peoples that might misuse it. So that's from the global perspective, is Indigenous activists and are trying to fight for Indigenous solutions and Indigenous led or co-led kind of solutions. And so then to have these statements be tied to these are Indigenous rights, is that starts to break down and discredit this identity of who Indigenous people are and the type of actions they will take. And so that's kind of this larger negative as it's seen on this global scale, and it starts to then take away what those different acts are. So if you read the book Red Alert, it was published, I believe, in 2009, but it is still relevant today, unfortunately, and what he talks about. But Daniel Wildcat, an Indigenous scholar and writer, talks about what he calls indigenuity, which is taking traditional Indigenous knowledge with modern day solutions to combat this. So by claiming you are Indigenous or you have that, it's claiming that you have all of these traditions and therefore you should legally be given more room to practice those types of things and to use this land. But then that excludes other people in the land as well, in a far right kind of attempt, or at least a very lazy attempt to make that argument.
And I think it's important to add there as well that energy, what's the word I'm looking for? Energy interests of the UK don't just stop within the borders of the UK. You know, what happens here has a huge impact on Indigenous people and on lots of other people around the world. But how do you connect those sort of huge, big sort of global frameworks of Indigenous rights to the context of Manchester?
So one is through sharing Indigenous stories or ideas and what they're going through to try to bring that to local, to build curiosity. And so for the schools program we're doing, what was so important to me about that was not just the typical, let's learn about a different culture, but only think about it as a different culture far away, but actually let's use that to question what's happening. So one activity we did was based on Wet'suwet'en kind of relationships between people, butterflies, medicine plants, and healing. And so these medicine plants, butterflies are pollinators, they're going to be near that. So Indigenous people can look for butterflies and know that where they are is medicine plants. When you start to break down the land and section off the land so people can't get to where these traditional places are, and you get this all over for Indigenous people as well, if you can't get to these places where you know medicine is because of how we've sectioned off land, then you're not going to be able to heal. And so there's going to be changes in your body and your diet. And so what we have the kids do is an interactive staged activity where at first you can reach everything. Well, then the land starts to get break up, so there's less plants. And then there's fences, you can't even get to it. And then we have them think about their own city. So now kids, you have a stomach ache, you know that this medicine plant can help. You know what it looks like. Could you find it? And so this is really based off of Mike McDonald, and he's an Indigenous artist, and he made these really cool butterfly gardens, but he didn't put them out in this nature outside of cities, but he actually put them throughout what's now known as British Columbia in major cities throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, and still alive today. People practice this as a way to bring medicine into these spaces, but also living art installations that were meant to resist this industrialization and these cities. So we were thinking about, how could we do that in Manchester? So it's a lot of, those are with the kids, but it's always, this is what's happening out here. Do we think science is going to save us here in Manchester? Everyone else who's being affected even more, it'll affect them, but we'll figure out some science or some technology before it gets to us. It'll be fine, but actually using their experiences to then also to build that solidarity, to build that empathy through reflecting how it happens in these neighborhoods here.
Amazing. That sounds like such an exciting sort of project to do. These children. And if you're about in Manchester, please do check out the work that Alexandra is doing. This is a question for sort of Charisse and Alexandra. What are some of the lessons that we can take from frontline communities and Indigenous philosophies and struggles into our collective climate action? Should we start with Charisse?
Okay. Yeah, I was because I was just going to look at you to one of it. Okay, so I think in a nutshell, organize, right? That's something that really comes from frontline communities. That's something we can really learn from them. We've seen how important mutual aid is, especially with COVID. We know the importance of community and of community resistance. Yeah, the power of collective community action is immense, of sharing knowledge and listening to each other, working together, finding common ground, shared goals, and then coming together to discuss and propose solutions that are made together with the community, by the community. Yeah, I think that's a huge lesson to take from frontline communities. And another is that you're never alone and we're stronger together, to sum it up. That's what I take from frontline communities, from Indigenous philosophies and struggles. That's what I take from it, and I think it's a good way to think about things.
Thank you, Alexandra.
I think especially, I forgot to introduce this part, I'm part Jemez Pueblo from what's now known as New Mexico. And I think even what's so important, because we believe in oral traditions, we don't believe in recording anything written down or recording this type of way, because once you start recording that, then there is a break from going to family and being in community and kinship. So that's kind of a background into this next idea, but people are coming together. Already that community stuff, you've heard that, but it's about this kinship. It's about conversation. It's not going, oh, I have to change the world by myself with my skills. And so I'm just going to do an individualist kind of come together, but everyone's apart. But actually, in having these longer conversations, coming together with communities, showing kinship, and that including like Christine J. Winter, who's at the University of Sydney, talks about as multi-species justice. I mean, that's when we're talking climate justice, it has to be multi-species justice, because that's our kin, the animal people and plant people. So it's thinking about your community as being so vast. And in those conversations, and plants can't speak English, they can't speak our Jemez language, they can't speak all of these other languages that might be spoken, but we can watch them. And so in that, how you bring other kinship together is, even though we want to run, action, is slowing down at times. So what an Indigenous perspective of this might be then to slow down and watch. You know what? I don't notice as many insects. Now that you mention it, the medicine plants that grew over here, I see way more dirt, and it's dry dirt. I don't see as many. So that slowness and that collectiveness, and you need multiple generations in order to have those conversations. So I think that's what's really important. And many Indigenous peoples believe in 6 generations thinking. So we're making decisions based on the conditions we want for 6 generations ahead. Or it might be, so that's like more for Sami. If you've watched the Reindeer Belong to the Wind, it's a film by the Sami, which is amazing. Watch it if you can get a hold of it. But sometimes 6 generations for Indigenous peoples is sometimes you're in the middle and you're learning from 3 generations behind you in order to benefit 3 generations ahead of you. So I think those are other ways of thinking. Is I'm not making a decision for tomorrow. I'm making a decision for so many generations. Generations I will not hear thank you from in my life, because I will not meet them. And to make actions for that far ahead is sometimes really tough, I think, especially when we want the gratitude right away in our lifetimes and we want to see it and enjoy what comes after. But actually, it's that long-term thinking as well. So I think there's a slowing down and a speeding up in bringing communities together to make action.
Yes, and as you were speaking, I was actually thinking about these little gifts that I got, which were part of an exhibition by or a project from the Knoll West Media Centre in Bristol, and they worked with an artist, Kajal Modi, to design these along with I think local members of the community. And it is all about that sort of thinking about, I just happen to have them next to me, thinking about forms of knowledge that exist in the non-human, as well as different ways of thinking within human knowledges as well. And it was, it's really interesting to sort of decenter ourselves and decenter like the way that we are taught things, in order to really think about what does nature need from us, what do we need from each other. And yeah, I would highly recommend checking these out. And so we'll get to some of the questions that are coming through in the Q&A in a few moments. Please do keep them coming. I have another question, which is for all of you. Climate justice it's really complex, and it can quite often be difficult to separate facts from PR, from corporate spin, from the people who ultimately stand to benefit from the way that things are. And it's quite often, it's called greenwashing. You might have heard that term. And it's quite often from the very same industries who are behind the climate crisis. So, oil companies telling us that they are, they're renewable now, and then you look at their investments and it's actually only 3% of their company's investment, and actually what they're doing is then finding more and more harmful ways of looking for fossil fuels. How do we learn to recognize this, and what should we be demanding of governments to really hold them and hold polluting industries to account as well? Becky, should we start with you?
Shooting back up to the high level perspective, I guess. I think connecting the local to the global to the local. So, we've talked about this kind of failure to deliver on finance commitments. And really what we need to demand of our governments is accountability and transparency. And this delivery on financial commitments might be one thing, but it's about how that money is spent, what it's spent on, and who it reaches. And so we need, I think, the investments, we need to see them reaching the local level. We need to also have them evaluated. We need to know if they're delivering on their intended aim. So far more transparency. So is funding for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, is it reaching the right people? Is it reaching communities on the front line? And who is engaged in framing and understanding both the problems and the solutions in those communities? And who's making decisions? It's not enough for people to participate. There's a lot of token participation going on. It's about people being involved in actually the decision-making process itself, not just being asked for their opinion and then somebody else makes the solution. So, you know, we need to see that connection translate to the local level, and we need much greater scrutiny and evidence to learn what's working and what's not. And that's what we need to call for.
Amazing. Alexandra, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, other than just to add with that transparency and kind of that more evidence, is I want to see more data stories. I want to see where this data comes from, what's not included, but alongside literacy. So one project I was part of outside of the Indigenous perspectives was a comic called COVID-19 Data Literacy is for Everyone. And we put that out as just a way to explain how people might read these charts, because at the time, you know, and it's the same with climate, is they will shape those charts and these data and put out this evidence, which is usually in data and these different graphs, in ways that they won't tell you the denominator and numerator. They won't tell you where these different numbers came from. So it might look like you're doing fine, but actually in all these putting out this evidence is, and bearing it in really jargonistic reports, is that there should be a companion that analyzes these. Do I expect them to do that? No. So actually, to all of the artists here and illustrators and different groups, it is kind of like the first activist action as a lot of people come together and they pick these through. So I think it would be demanding more of that context and that transparency, but also linking it to how then they present their evidence as well.
Amazing. And Charisse, have you got anything to include?
Yeah, when I was thinking about greenwashing, the first thing that came to mind was this, I think it was last week, like United Airlines, that posted something like, for the first time ever, a commercial carrier will fly an aircraft full of passengers using 100% sustainable fuel. And then, you know, people were like, oh, wow, that's awesome. I saw it being shared like in my Twitter feeds and stuff. And then it wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't honest either, because it was using selective disclosure, because one engine used 100% sustainable fuel. So when I think about greenwashing, I just think, yeah, corporations are really good at obfuscating. And the thing about it is it's impact over intent. So you got to watch what they're doing as well as what they're saying. You know, it's like when you've got a dog and you pretend to throw the ball, they look for it and they might even run for it. It's a distraction. So when companies say things like, we're offsetting our emissions, or we're using materials made of recycled ocean plastics, are they looking into climate impacts of their investments? Are they exploiting people for labor? Like, what's their supply chain looking like? Are they taking long-term action to reduce their impact, et cetera? Or is it surface level? Are they having us look one way while they're holding the ball behind their backs, basically? So I would say it's just important to ask critical questions and dig deeper. It's greenwashing is just another way to delay taking action on climate change. And so, yeah, we mentioned there's policy aspects of changing it. And then there's also, you know, name and shame. There's the individual stuff, but yeah, importantly, I think we need to advocate for regulations that call for mandatory due diligence, because I think the onus shouldn't just be on consumers, and companies should manage those risks. Yeah, and they should be penalized if they cause harm.
Thank you. And I liked the analogy of, you know, a dog being distracted, because it also does sometimes feel like you are you're a dog chasing its tail, trying to you know, live sustainably, when it's quite impossible within the structures that we exist in, without that big structural change, without, you know, polluters paying, without governments regulating that, without, you know, without a real overhaul in how we live as a collective, as a society, rather than, changing how we live individually. This is what we mean when we say system change, not climate change. The last question that I'll ask very quickly before we get to the Q&A is for Alex. What are your ambitions for the future of this work that you're doing in Manchester?
So my ambitions are to keep growing with this and embed this in as a part of the institutional change that the Manchester Museum is already going on. So what are these big changes, but to make sure that that is also about confronting epistemic injustice. So whose knowledge counts, because there's all different, because we're part of a university system, we're also subject to some of those types of way of writing about knowledge and confirming and evidencing knowledge, but to continue to break this down so that we can come to epistemic humility and thinking about how the types of knowledge that we validate. And so that's really important with Indigenous peoples and their narratives, because we hold so much in our collections. And Shelley Angeli-Segar said in one of our talks that also are tied to the conversations about land rights for Indigenous peoples. Like, we have the evidence that we got from all these terrible colonial collectors from those areas that identified as theirs and their claim to the land, their place in the land, and how a lot of these objects and ancestors, they lived well in that land because they had no concept of nature, because they didn't need one, because it was always a part of their everyday and they saw themselves as a part of it. So I want to continue growing that way of thinking and that way of how we question the different science that's held up, as well as the different ways we tell stories about people, and really try to sit with complexity, because giving agency to Indigenous peoples as well, and not just telling horror stories, because we tell these stories, especially around climate change, was we tend to tell sometimes stories that get so wrapped up in painting Indigenous peoples only as traumatic victims. But actually the solutions that they're coming up with, solutions that don't need tons of science or chemicals, that are the lessons we need. And so trying to get that so that I humanize Indigenous people, as well as try to move away from even that liberal appetite of wanting to have the traumatic victim, and trying to break down that we all have something to learn in confronting our worldview and our view of people.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I think it's super important that we recognize Indigenous people and other people who are really impacted by climate change as originators of solutions as well. I mean, people were living for hundreds and thousands of years perfectly fine, and we've had a couple of 100 years of industrialization and colonialism and capitalism, and it's fairly obvious where the issue is, right? So we'll go to a couple of questions. So the first one from Laura Jones. You mentioned the injustice and inequity for Black communities and people of colour. You haven't mentioned yet the inequity for disabled people, including that disabled people account for 59% of all COVID deaths, despite making up 18% of the population in the UK. Often disabled people are limited in their available choices and are some of the most vulnerable people. Things like banning single-use plastic have disproportionately affected disabled people who often need them for access purposes. They also have limited funds, as the additional cost of being disabled conflicts with the often more expensive, more environmentally friendly choices. Can you comment on the challenges of climate justice for disabled people? I have some answers, but I want to open it up to the panel first. Charisse, maybe if you have.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for asking that question. And you're right, I didn't mention it, and it's something that does need to be made explicit. There's absolutely disabled people, like you said, they've been left behind. They're often left behind. And as we saw with COVID, I would also say though, you can be disabled and also Black and you can be disabled and a person of color. So those things will affect, I mean, if you add that onto it, then that's going to affect you even more. So then when you think of for instance, like hurricanes or floods and people who need to evacuate, well, it's going to be more difficult for somebody with like a physical disability to get out of there. And a lot of times this is also a health justice issue. A lot of times there's not as great of access to healthcare. And, I know in my family too, we've got people with really bad asthma. And that's also an issue. And when it gets hotter, they're going to have a really hard time. And so you're absolutely right that climate justice is a disability justice issue, and it does need to be at the forefront. It is something that needs to be talked about more. You mentioned the straws. That's something else, right? On the environmental justice side, where that's a perfect example of how policies made in like, oh, well, we think that we're doing something good, right? Yeah, this plastic pollution, we'll get rid of the straws. But you didn't include you must have not consulted with the right people, because anybody from the disabled community would have told you, no, we need those. That's not the biggest issue. Actually, the biggest issue around plastics is fishing gear. So again, I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, does anyone else have anything to add?
I would just add, I think that was a perfect response, but I would just add, I think to be called well-intentioned is not a compliment in this kind of area, these kind of things, and that actually in sitting with that complexity, there are so many times we need to reflect, even if we have such good intentions, that there's going to be assumptions that we have built into us. And so making sure that we try to, even if we can't physically get everyone in a room for a meeting, if we can't get everyone into a Zoom, but taking the time to have those conversations, it'll slow down things, but otherwise you might build in ableist policies without even realizing it, because you yourself have never had to struggle in a certain way. But also thinking about how diverse disability is, and differently abled bodies are. And so making sure that also isn't just tokenistic, because it's easier to just reach out to the one person. So I think that's turning things more into open conversations is really good.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd also like to add that this is again a problem of the systems that dictate how we live. The way that we live is inherently ableist. The way that we work is, I know there's a few neurodivergent people on the panel here. It's hard to work in this sort of way that churns things out, and productivity, capitalism, this constant need to produce, which is what is destroying the planet, is also it is an ableist way of working. And a lot of the solutions that come through the grassroots, which take into account disability, really advocate for completely different ways of living, of different ways of working, and those should be completely centered in everything that we do when we're talking about climate justice. And we've seen it with COVID. COVID was a mass disabling event for people all around the world, and it should be a huge wake-up call for us to live differently. I think I read something the other day that it was some ridiculously tiny number of homes in the UK are set up for disabled people to live in properly, and something like 13% maybe, don't hold me to that. And that shows the complete failures of anyone who has the power to change that kind of policy in talking about disability issues. So thank you so much for bringing that up, and also to remind everyone that in whichever way you are marginalized in this society, if you are from a marginalized gender, if you are queer, if you are working class, you will be also impacted by the climate crisis in a disproportionate way. And we need to bring all of those conversations to the table. We've got a question from Zoe Razbash. How can we start embedding principles of climate justice within the operations of creative businesses and integrating them into our internal climate action plans? Who would like to take this on the panel? I have a couple of questions. Alex?
I can add to that. I think one thing would be in your collaborations is to start asking questions before you sign contracts. And I know there's amazing Indigenous people that are working on actually putting their perspectives into contract writing when they're working with people and asking like, well, where's the accountability part of the contract that tells me how the thing we're doing now is going to affect maybe this area, this focus of environmental justice in 10 years' time. So thinking about the longevity of the different actions, but also making it a part of everything that you do. So talking about sustainability, talking about the carbon footprint, talking about all these different things and absolutely everything you do, and making sure that's just that normal part of what you go through in your actions and your decision making. So I think that's, and even if you write it down on a little card and put it next to your desk so that you have that physical reminder and it's not stuck on something online you might forget to open in a folder, but having those questions like, oh, have I checked that we've talked about and we've looked into where our suppliers come from and where their companies are based. And that was something with what Cherise said earlier, was a lot of these companies, they might have random buildings on Indigenous people's lands that do factory work, or it might be something like that. So where are these sources coming from? And just simple questions to start embedding that into your decision-making processes. And that might first take you making very explicit how your organization makes decisions. Because if you haven't done that work, it's something you definitely should do, because a lot of decision-making is not, it happens organically. No, it doesn't, like nepotism or these types of things. So it's figuring out where those are happening.
And that's a great answer. Yeah, I think from my perspective, it might, I don't know if it's a JB perspective just yet, but yeah, I think that starting with looking at your finances and your supply chains, pensions are a really important thing. I think in the UK, our pension investments are some of the biggest investments that go into fossil fuels. So looking at that kind of thing, like who do you take money from and where do you invest it, is a really important thing. And Culture Unstained do lots of work, particularly with museums, looking at like ethical sponsorship and funding in museums. And they're a fantastic organization. They've got lots of reports online about that. And then I think the other question to ask on the sort of more practical side is like, who is the work that you're doing for? Who are you speaking to? Who are you speaking over? And how do you bring all of those different perspectives and different people into the work that you're doing? You know, I think that climate justice touches everything. So if you're putting on a show about gender, if you're putting on a show about, you know, God, anything food, it's everything touches climate justice, and there's always a way to bring climate justice into the conversation. Oh, and another one from Vicky.
I was just going to add, that was a wonderful answer. I was just going to add that so one thing we haven't touched on probably enough is the power of cultural and arts organizations to make a change by using your position and your voice to influence society. And I think that there's absolutely, look internally at possibly where your supply chain issues might be. Make your supply chains transparent. If you don't understand where something comes from, find out. And, you know, and could that have any rights issues associated with it? But that's the internal side, and that's almost what we can control. And I think the other thing that we can do is advocate. We can put climate justice front and center. We can call for it. We can use marginalized voices and bring those to the fore. We can work with local social movements and social justice movements and climate change, climate justice organizations, and learn together, and then produce together and use that collective voice to advocate for action and embed it in society.
Yeah, that's a really great reminder of the power that the creative sector has as well. You know, we were part of a campaign ahead of the general election to get 2 million under 30s registered to vote with climate change as their top issue. And, you know, that's something that a lot of the arts organizations that we work with were part of. And, you know, perhaps we should think about in our policies what you feel aligned to as an organization and how you contribute to that movement as well. So we've got loads of questions. We might have to respond to some of these in our follow-up email. This is a question specifically for you, Alexandra. I'm curious to know a bit about the process by which the Manchester Museum decided to create a position of curator of Indigenous perspectives. It seems like a very innovative practice for a UK museum. And that was from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. So I obviously wasn't there at the time, so I think some of the more nuanced discussions I can't speak to, but Manchester Museum, I think, likes to sit with the trouble, air quotes on that, and likes to really push things and be quite radical. And so the role came from acknowledging that for the entire existence of the museum and most museums, it's been run by one cultural perspective, and quite a homogenized cultural perspective of Western worldview, because it's not just British, but even within what we consider the West, things getting erased and homogenized into an idea of colonization. And so recognizing that going forward, we started to return human remains in the very early 2000s, being fully accountable to what these were coming from and working, and that's, in my opinion, wow, only then, but that was quite radical for that time. But it started thinking about these aren't just transactions, but they're relationships, and in building these relationships and doing more repatriations beyond human remains and things is actually understanding the value of those relationships, but recognizing you don't quite understand how other people view the world. And so in this response, Indigenous perspectives was really about decolonization. Other people have different definitions. Decolonization, for me, the museums are still at the center, because it's the actions we need to make to unpick our histories. But that keeps the power with us. But around this time, there's more and more work around the concept of indigenization, both in research and museums and just in general in culture. And so that is shifting power away from us. And so that my role is really a role that came from these types of conversations, these questioning what we could do better, what we could try more, and bringing me in. And we have all of these different collections, but I also sit across collections. So immediately people think I must just work with the cultural material, but recognizing that actually there's Indigenous perspectives in everything. So I work with from entomology with the insects to botany to zoology to everything, a little bit in geology too. And we're working with the curator of paleontology to really get it also with the dinosaurs and thinking about that as well. So it's everything. And I think it was just a conscious decision about where we see decolonization needing to be, where it needed to be, and trying to take that forward.
Amazing. Yeah, it's such an exciting role to see. I remember when I saw it, I immediately like tracked you down because I was so interested in the idea that a museum would create that would have that kind of intent. And that's really important. So yeah, it's amazing. Okay, another question from an anonymous attendee. As life expectancy gets longer, how do we reach adults to better make them understand the climate issue? The pressure on young people and children is disproportionate, and many adults claiming it's not their problem contribute to the issues that their children will face. Actually, I want to take this because I do a lot of work with young people, and it's so difficult. You know, I see lots of the young people that I mentor or that I speak to are incredibly passionate and incredibly smart, but they're losing their childhoods to trying to fight for a future. And I think that the best way to get adults to understand that is to make it make sense to what they care about. You know, if people care about their house prices, you know, a lot of the UK is going to be underwater in a couple of decades. You know, it's going to impact your house prices. You know, your whatever it is that makes sense to adults, we have to pounce on it and we have to make it real for them. Because I mean, if you have somebody who can watch children and young people fighting for their lives out there and not feel moved by it, then I think that person, you're not going to get it through like putting more pressure on young people to make it real for them. You know, we've got to step up as adults, and I kind of feel like sometimes that we fail our young people by calling them our saviors and saying that they're doing this for us. They're not doing this for us. They're doing it for themselves as well, and we need to step up and do it for them. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
Yeah, no, that honestly, that's exactly what I was going to say. That's what I work. So I don't work with youth much, and I'm always like, why is there so much stuff only for youth? Like, why are all these like funders? It's always for youth. It's always for youth, and that's great. I want, yes, engaged youth. We love it. But also, I'm like, no, we're not off the hook as adults. Okay, like we need to be doing so much more. And so, personally, I try to advocate for exactly what you were saying. Making it make sense to people, connecting, showing them those connections. So that means if it's just a personal conversation you're having with someone, you don't have to start talking about climate change. You just get to know what is something that they actually care about, get into a conversation about that, and it'll make its way there. Then you start talking about, oh, well, yeah, like this is going to happen. And, you're talking about housing. Let's say you live on a coast and be like, right. So, flooding, or even here, like flooding here in London, flooding is going to be a really big problem. It's already showing that's a problem, and your home is in a flood zone. So, these are things that you should think about. Or again, usually if it affects somebody's pocket or if it affects somebody's health, I usually feel like that's a good way to get them to start thinking about it.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so what I'm going to suggest is that we take all of the unanswered questions and we respond to them, and we send those around with our follow-up email. This webinar will also, it's being recorded, so that will be sent around to you with all of the slides and details of how to get in touch with everyone. I want to open it up for any last comments or questions or recommendations for where you can get good news and resources about climate justice. What's your go-to? Should we start with Vicky?
I'm going to hit the science. Carbon Brief is a great source. It's got a lovely Q&A on climate justice, which is very explanatory. Mary Robinson's book on climate justice is fantastic. There are so many, and the more you read, the more you it leads you down other avenues. So there is so much to learn. I've got a huge amount to learn. I think, appreciating that, recognizing that, and just continuing to dig in where you find things interesting and relevant and you want to know more. There's too many resources. I'm going to let somebody else chuck in some of theirs.
Alex?
Sure. And now it's just one of those things where I wish I would have wrote down the first thought I had. But I think, Robin, if you're thinking about trying to model that slower relationship with nature and thinking about it in long and dynamic ways, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is an amazing book to read. Also, Daniel Wildcat's Red Alert is really great if you're kind of new to this. And if you want to move away from books and that's not the medium that really works for you, then I would say check out the work of National Geographic photographer Kili Yuan. And I can send a link, but Kili talks about this complexity, talks about artistic practice and being in communities and how you kind of negotiate that in such an amazing way. And he's such a smart and lovely person. So I would definitely look up kind of stuff that he's done because he's given some talks. And yeah, just consume different creators' stuff, different cultures, and just experience that and kind of sit with that and see where that leaves you. There was something else I was going to say, but I forgot it now, so I'll just leave it there.
Amazing. Charisse?
Yeah, so like Vicky was saying, every day is a school day, basically, right? Like you're always going to be learning. You're always going to be learning. I've already learned so much just being here, from all three of you. And the questions that people ask have got me thinking about things. And also I appreciate, Alex, I appreciate you mentioning that it's not always just books, right? Like the resources can be talking to someone, right? Talking to an elder. Resources can be games. So like shameless plug, my group and I created a game last year called the Isthmus Project, which was taking people on like a journey around the land system and then all of the inequalities therein. We're still working on that though, so it's not a board game yet. I'll let you know when it is. Then it depends, like, what are you interested in? Yeah, we got science, you've got journal articles, all of that stuff, but there's novels, you don't always have to read nonfiction. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. And then lastly, I will say, Twitter. I learn a lot of things from Twitter, seriously. You can follow activists, community leaders, advocates, journalists, writers, academics, just so many people with important perspectives and interesting insights. So yeah, I'd say I have tons of books, tons of articles. There's just books everywhere. But I've learned the most from friends and colleagues and being in conversation with people who work on and care about various aspects of climate change and climate justice. So just, have those conversations.
I remembered what I was going to say. Charisse reminded me is open access. So Stop Line 3 is an Indigenous group that created these wonderful prints and artworks about stopping pipeline. But a part of what they were doing was that these resources be open access. So I think it's like also like, and that's why I was like, I don't want to just suggest a book because that's behind a paywall. You have to purchase it unless your friend can borrow it to you, or you can find it from a library. But actually in doing the kind of work you might do going forward is that open access. And it's right with what you said earlier, is who are you making this for? Who is this for, and how would they access it? And how can equitable practices be built into that as well? But with the Twitter thing reminded me, oh yes, open access, though we won't get about algorithms.
Amazing. Yes. Everything should be open access as much as possible. Thank you all, Charisse, Vicky, and Alexandra. Please stay with us just for another second or two. as we mentioned at the start of this webinar, this is such a hugely complex topic and will form a big part of Julie's Bicycle's focus from now on. So we're planning a much bigger series on these issues, and we'll be doing another webinar in February, looking more at the concepts of loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation. And we'll send more details for that in the follow-up email. But you can also help us to shape the rest of our series by filling out this poll, which I will get up now. So let us know what you would like to see most in the next in the future Creative Climate Justice series. So ethical funding and sponsorship, land justice, nature and biodiversity, supply chains, materials and resources, politics and policies, intersectional justice focused programming, green democracy or environmental justice. And, you know, if you have any suggestions or case studies or anything you'd like to share, you can also get in touch with me. So that's farah@juliesbicycle.com. And yeah, I'm always up for hearing people's suggestions. Give you just another couple of seconds. Okay. Give you 10 seconds to respond. Great. So I'll end it here, and we have yes, lots of well, it's quite evenly spread, but yeah, ethical funding and sponsorship, intersectional justice focused programming, land justice, nature and biodiversity coming out top there. So yes, you'll be hearing more from us very soon about the rest of the series. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Vicky, Alex, and Charisse for your incredible insights. The recording of this event will be available on our website shortly, and we'll send around a follow-up email when it's ready for you as well, with all of these other links. There'll be a short survey at the very end of this as you leave, so please, if you have a moment, do fill it out and we can keep improving what we're doing. If you want to hear more about Julie's Bicycle's creative climate justice work, check out our series of creative climate chats, our podcast, The Colour Green, our film series with the British Council, which you can find on our policy portal. I think some of these links might be coming into the chat, and our film series, The Colour Green in Conversation, which was filmed at the Grand Junction in London earlier this year. And please also keep your eyes peeled for a briefing and a resource hub, which will be landing sometime early next year. You can keep in touch on social media, and you can share today's conversation with the hashtag Creative Climate Justice and sign up to our mailing list to hear about all the news and events from us. So thank you all so much. And that will be it.